Good morning, everyone. This is Nathan Lindorf with the Rational Independent, and today we've got a good one. Finally, something with substance. The New York Times posted an article, Liberal Wins Wisconsin Court Race in Victory for Abortion Rights Backers. So, before we jump into this, I just want to clarify with everyone. I was under the impression that an explicitly partisan judiciary was a bad thing. I was under the impression that millions of dollars from out-of-state donors influencing local and state elections was a bad thing. I was under the impression that both Republicans and Democrats gerrymandered legislative boundaries in an effort to give themselves the maximum advantage in their local legislature. But apparently, it's only a bad thing when the Republicans do it? Okay, let's get in the article. I'm probably going to butcher the name, but the justice in this case, the newly elected judge, is Janet Protasewicz. Protasewicz? We're going to go Judge Janet, because I can't do the name. Judge Janet prevailed in the state's highly consequential contest for the Supreme Court, which will now be likely to reverse the state's abortion ban and end the use of gerrymandered maps. Apparently, there's a 7-seat Supreme Court in Wisconsin, and prior to this, it had been 3 liberals and 4 conservatives. I was under the impression the judiciary was supposed to be impartial. But all through this article, it's very clear that they basically just say, listen, judges are people too, so they have partisan objectives, and that just is what it is. So it's one of those interesting reporting tricks where if we want to, we can pretend that justices are supposed to be impartial robots that just read the text and interpret the text. Unless it's convenient for our point of the day to say, oh, but isn't it wonderful and human and humane that the judge sees this need and ignores the law as written or rewrites the law. If you are a skilled reporter, you can frame the conversation. It's an incredibly powerful tool in the language, in the culture, in the conversation that we all have to be able to frame the conversation. Anyone who's ever had a small child understands how important it is to be able to frame the conversation. When you have a small child, you don't say, what do you want for dinner? You say, do you want grilled cheese or spaghetti for dinner? You have now framed the conversation. You have circumscribed the universe of options, which is way too many options for a small child to figure out. And you said, here's 2 reasonable options. Pick one of them. You've enabled them to choose, but you have circumscribed the options. And most children will gladly choose from the options given. Now, the interesting thing is a small percentage of children will say, I want pizza, whatever. Pick something not on the menu. And that's a wonderful thing. It's frustrating as a parent, but it's a wonderful thing because we're doing the same thing in our politics, where the news media, the voices that we all hear, that we all share in common, present, hey, here's an option or here's an option. Pick one. And a small percentage of cantankerous independent thinkers say, I'll take option C. It's good for there to be a contrary voice to say, hey, there's more out here than what's being framed. I'm going to dive into this because the New York Times touches on a handful of issues that they're very happy about. And it's interesting, when our emotions take over, sometimes we're a little more honest than we'd otherwise be. It's clear that the author is and supportive of this Judge Janet, and her positions, and is excited that this has happened. And so I think they're saying the quiet part out loud a little bit in this article. That's why I'm excited to cover it. Flipping majority control after the state of an election that happened just yesterday, Judge Janet defeated a conservative former Supreme Court justice who sought a return to the bench. So it's pretty difficult to beat an incumbent. And initially when I read it, I thought that's what happened. What this means is that there was a vacant seat, probably due to retirement. And so there was 2 candidates, one of whom had already served on the bench, had left for a time, and was seeking a return. So she beat him. and won the seat, and won by 11 percentage points, which is pretty big, especially since Wisconsin is a battleground state. I want to just read this paragraph because it makes me so happy. The contest, which featured over $40 million in spending, was the most expensive judicial election in American history. Early on, Democrats recognized the importance of the race for a swing seat on the top court in one of the country's perennial political battlegrounds. Millions of dollars from out of state poured into Wisconsin to back this Judge Janet, and a host of national Democratic groups rallied behind her campaign. Do you think the New York Times would be just as excited if the Republicans had poured millions of dollars of out-of-state donations into a state judicial race? No, they would not be fans of that. And they've expressed many times concerns and worries when Republicans do this exact thing. In other words, when they do it, it's wrong. But when we do it, look how wonderful and virtuous. It worked, and therefore it's virtuous. Here's the second thing. Very next paragraph. Judge Janet shattered long-held notions of how judicial candidates should conduct themselves by making her political priorities central to her campaign. She made explicit her support for abortion rights and her objection to gerrymandered legislative maps. In other words, she ran as a political partisan. I thought justices were supposed to be impartial, or at very least to hold themselves back from commentary on political issues. Again, it's foolish. People don't do that, and judges are people. So it's a foolish dream, but that's still that's the standard of what's supposed to happen, or so I understood. Since Judge Janet won, it's amazing how she shattered preconceived, long-held notions of how judicial candidates should conduct themselves. The other justice that lost has some sour grapes moments. And again, I didn't follow this campaign at all. I have no idea what the campaigning was like, what the ads were like, whether they cast aspersions on his character, any of that. But he says his rival's campaign is truly beneath contempt. The rancid slanders were launched against me. That may be true. I just plead ignorance. I don't know. But he was not pleased. Looks like he didn't call to offer his concessions. He was pretty cranky. He concluded, this is the loser of the campaign, he concluded the final speech of his campaign by saying, "I wish Wisconsin the best of luck because I think it's going to need it." Again, this is an interesting article because these are typically not things that are said out loud. These are typical things you have to kind of dig and look for implications and draw your inferences and try and figure out what they meant as they hinted towards something. It's kind of a mask-off moment on both sides. Judge Janet made a calculation from the start of the race that Wisconsin voters would reward her for making clear her position on abortion rights and the legislative maps. So the article does go into some history about the role the court has played in politics. So it goes back to, there was a prior governor of Wisconsin, Scott Walker, briefly in contention for a presidential spot. I want to say 2008, maybe 2012, somewhere in there, and it never really got anywhere. He tried to overhaul some of the state government, and the Supreme Court at the time backed him up on that. His particular bugbear, Scott Walker, Governor Walker. Public employee unions, also looking at voting restrictions, like requiring state-issued identification and banning ballot drop boxes. Those are not voting restrictions, okay? Those are voting requirements. A voting restriction says this group of people can't do this by virtue of who they are. You're restricted. For instance, if you're 15 years old, you can't vote. That's a voting restriction. 15-year-olds can't legally vote. If you're not a legal citizen of the United States, you can't legally vote. Voting requirements, like we'd like secure elections, so we'd like to see who's dropping off ballots, so we don't have public drop boxes. You have to bring it in where a person could supervise. That's not a voting restriction. That's just good process. Saying you need to have a state-issued ID, which, by the way, is free or basically free. That is simply saying we'd like to have good process. I have no problem with any of those reforms. I did want to point out, and this is a bugbear of mine, but I'm going to try not to go too far down the rabbit hole. Public employee unions are insane. And here's why they're insane. Public employees form a union. Public employees are paid through tax dollars. That's where their salaries come from. So they form a union, and their union representatives negotiate with state authorities. They negotiate with the people who pay their salaries. And so what they say is, hey, pay us more. Nathan from the Edit Couch here. I neglected one key important point about why public employee unions are bonkers. What they're saying is, pay us more with tax dollars. In other words, not your dollars, tax dollars. Pay us more out of tax dollars, which is no skin off your back. And in return, we'll help you get elected. We'll donate those tax dollars that you paid us to help you get elected. That's what makes it crazy. In a private union, they're negotiating with management and owners, which need to pay money out of their own pockets to feed the union, not a third party. Support us, and we'll help you get elected. It's quid pro quo. You know, one hand washes the other. No, that's not the term. I'll scratch your back, you scratch mine. It's worth a deep dive of its own, but it is rife with corruption. Public employee unions are crazy. Everywhere where they've been done breeds rampant corruption. It spirals out of control. And Governor Walker was trying to gut that. And honestly, more power to him. I think that's a wonderful thing. Conservative justices backed his efforts and helped him do that. And now the article is saying, now we get to push back on that. We won't have such worries as that. We can go back to supporting the leftists. Once Judge Janet assumes, this is back quoting the article, once Judge Janet assumes her place on the court on August 1st, the first priority for Wisconsin Democrats will be to bring a case to challenge the current legislative maps. In other words, a president of a local progressive law firm says he would file a legal request for the Supreme Court to hear a redistricting case the day after Judge Janet is seated. Strike anyone else as political bias? Doesn't that point anyone else saying, we are clearly going to use the judiciary to push through something that we think is important, that our side thinks is important. The moment we have a one-vote majority, we're going for it. Not to say I'm a fan of gerrymandering, but the idea that only Republicans gerrymander is silly. The last paragraph, give them the last word, comes back to the abortion ban. The state's abortion ban, which was enacted in 1849, it's been the law in the books for a while, is already being challenged by the Attorney General in Wisconsin. This week, a circuit court is scheduled to hear the first oral arguments on a case. Whichever way a county judge rules, the case is all but certain to advance on appeal to the state Supreme Court later this year. So that's the article. A juicy one. I kind of like it. And here's why I like it. The masks come off a bit. All too often I'm digging through these articles and I'm looking for a way people just subtly shift and carefully frame and phrase things. And it's harder to draw clear lines between this framing means this statement means this, etc. It's much easier when it's all blatant and out like this. Here's the other reason why I like it. This is why the Supreme Court made the right decision to reverse Roe versus Wade. Abortion should not be decided from the top down. It should be a state's issue. The federal government doesn't have a voice in it. This is an example of a state wrangling with this challenging issue. They're voting on it. They're talking about it. They're trying to structure their local political process to deal with the way their constituents within the state of Wisconsin feel about this issue. Now, I have my own personal perspective. Frankly, abortion is murder. That's how I look at it. But I'm not God and I'm not king. And even though I feel that very strongly, I don't get to enact my feelings on everybody else, other than whatever I can do to persuade people, whatever I can do to influence the conversation. If you take controversial issues out of the hands of local representatives, if you take it out of that and put it in the federal government's hands, you've effectively silenced the debate on that issue. You've removed it from political bodies that are responsive to the electorate and put it under the control of a political body that is not responsive to the electorate. The reason why they have lifetime appointments is so that they don't have to worry about re-election. They're allowed to say and do whatever they want for as long as they're alive, once they're in, precisely so they can act without regard to the political winds. That means that if you have Supreme Court justices you don't agree with, you can't debate them. You can't persuade them. You can't shift them. They just are. And that creates an environment where you have pent up frustration, where you have pent up anger, where you have a demand, a rising demand among the electorate for people who want to make a change, but they can't because the control over that change has been removed from electorally responsive bodies to something like the Supreme Court. Congratulations to Judge Janet on her recent victory. Good job for being very, very clear that you are a partisan political actor who's going to use your role on the state Supreme Court to push leftist and democratic agenda points. If that's what your state wants, then you're going to get it good and hard. As the loser said, I wish the state of Wisconsin the best of luck. They're going to need it. I think that just about wraps it up for me today. I want to issue a thank you to the people who've taken the time to comment on my videos. I'm getting more comments now. I'm having a chance to engage in conversations. I appreciate it. If you like what you're hearing, drop a like, check out some of my other shorts, check out my long form videos. I publish Monday through Friday every day on topics of the day, one of the top articles on Reddit. If you don't like it, drop a comment, disagree with me, let me know what you think. The goal of this channel is to show that a regular citizen with no special training or certification can engage in the political debate in a productive way, can apply some basic critical thinking, some basic reasoning, some basic persuasive techniques, and engage with the political conversation and possibly help to shift the conversation in a productive way. I know I can do it. I want to show you because I think you can do it too. Engage with this commentary. Reply with a short of your own. Reply with a comment. Start your own channel. More voices are better than less voices. And I hope when you see this, that you might take a chance to try it yourself. Thank you everyone for your time. That is today's Reddit rant. Good luck out there.